All right.
um, let's see. So like, what do you have on your mind? So, are we talking about capitalism in general? You want to talk about like Jeff Bezos slash billionaires, trillionaires,
We can talk about that.
like
I
that?
think that whole debate is so interesting to me, and I don't know. On Twitter, you have like the extreme polarized version of politics. So you have the people
Mm-hmm.
that are like eat the rich, and then you have the people that are like I'm literally Jeff Bezos, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
so, um, but I don't know.
Wait,
It
the
seems
people that
like
are like literally Jeff Bezos, and he's commenting like, "Bro, don't eat me." That's
yeah,
kind of
no, like
gross.
it's literally like Elon Musk like commenting on me, like responding to you. It's like it's the funniest meme ever, right? Because you have like
Mm-hmm.
the richest of the rich speaking with the poor, or not the poor of the poor, but like the
Just
socialists
like,
essentially.
yeah, yeah. So like a lot of the affluent white community.
Yeah, pretty much, pretty much.
So you have
Um,
the middle class and upper middle class white community slash like the college debt ridden millennials.
dude, I find that so interesting that like it's mostly people that are somewhat well off that are like actual proponents of like Marxist philosophy. Like Marx wasn't wrong about everything, right? Like, but
Mm-hmm.
like I think anybody that I was listening. Have you heard of a guy called Jordan Peterson? I think I told you about him
Yeah, yeah.
before.
I've heard of Jordan
Yeah,
Peterson.
I was watching one of his like lectures at Cambridge, and he was talking about how he can't fathom how people like millennials will like talk about socialism and like communism as if it's a feasible idea because we tried that experiment the entire 20th century and like 50 million people died from it. And
Mm-hmm.
like after I thought about that, like it's very interesting. Like millennials, like 1990s and afterwards, like people that just were not around for most of that drama,
Mm-hmm.
like they missed the Cold War, they missed like communism, they missed the fall of the like Soviet Union, all of that, and like yet we're so quick to like latch onto the idea as if we like did not read a history book or have
Mm-hmm.
listened to our grandparents.
Although I do think that like like saying that socialism, how it's practiced in like a country like the Nordic countries, or even how it's practiced in like some South American countries, right? And saying that's the same as like USSR
Oh yeah,
communism. I think that's a little bit overblown. Like I think that's like one of my critiques of like the critique of a lot of like right wing media people, right? And I think that like the Bernies of the world could do a lot better job of like distancing themselves from that, because that's not like what they're proposing, right? Like I don't know. I feel
yeah,
like it's a big, like, socialism has become like a meaningless word, in the sense it's just like a word that people use as a critique,
yeah,
and that critique doesn't really mean anything, because like how does a country like even Venezuela and like Sweden, how are those two things the same thing,
yeah,
right? Like
exactly.
they're completely different on any axis you look at, and then saying that they're both socialist countries, right? I don't know, right?
Yeah,
It depends on your definition of socialism. Like I think that by like how like in how Lushigo could like extend to the U.S., and I think if I were to like use like even the standard like dictionary definition of socialism, the U.S. would fall under that, right? Because we've kind of, in a lot of scenarios, like we've put a lot of industries in the hands of the government, right? Like so we've put like
yeah.
roads, military, education, right? Industries that we deem important to the social good, and then no one would really be a proponent for taking away. And we put those industries in the hand of the government, and no one's really complaining, right? And that's socialist.
Okay, but do you think that the private market would actually provide those goods, like the ones that you named?
Yeah, no, that's why I think it's a good thing, right? Like I think that we kind of use socialism as a catch-all, but we don't really understand that like most economies are mixed economies. They're not really capitalist or communist, right?
Yeah,
Outside of like the extremes, even China has like those zones where like they allow for like free markets,
yeah. It's
right?
I don't know. Like I think I used to be a lot more left leaning than I am now, but I think one of
Just because you
the
went to U Chicago.
pretty much.
Yeah.
Um, but I've been like I don't know. I'm like leaning like somewhat libertarian right now. But anyways, I
Ooh,
had a debate with one of
finally,
my
Jake. Finally.
I had a debate with one of my friends, and he brought up a pretty good point about why socialism, or like leaning more towards socialism than the U.S. already is, wouldn't work, and it's mainly because of multiculturalism. Like the reason his argument was that
Hmm.
the reason why it works in a lot of the Nordic countries is just because the populations are homogeneous, right? Like they're all blonde hair, blue eyed, like
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 I've heard,
Christians.
that argument, but like I really don't like. It's like one of my least favorite like arguments, kind of against more government intervention in terms of U.S. economies, right? Because that's not like those countries, like they're not homogeneous thinkers, one, right? Like they are
Yeah,
not like even all like they don't all believe the same things. They all have vastly different beliefs, right? They all have disputes, disagreements, arguments. I think the main difference between that country and this one, and the one I think that should be harped on, is trust in systems and institutions, right? I think that's the big factor, not the fact that we're like a ethnically diverse country, but the fact that like we don't trust our government, right? And that was made in large part by the past couple of decades of government failure, government gridlock, but also like kind of our whenever we hear anything about government intervention as a result of the Cold War, right? Like a couple of those factors mixed in, that's more like created than inherent, right? And I think that distinction is important, right? Because we're inherently a diverse country, right? And saying that
yeah,
that's the reason that we can't have, universal healthcare, right? Saying that's the reason we can't have universal healthcare is, in my opinion, just malpractice, right? I think that it's more like something that we created, like this aura of like the individual is against the government, and the government is kind of a restrictor on individual liberties, but only in a responsible way, versus like something that can aid us towards helping towards finding our goals, like kind of that
yeah.
relationship, our relationship with our government and how much we trust the system is different, not really the fact that we're different complexions, or from
Okay,
you know
so
what I mean.
so yeah, so following up with that idea, is the idea that like Americans can't trust government systems like a false pretense, or is it something that
No,
like
no, it's
th-
something that's like our trust in our institutions have like drastically like just fallen, like in the past like couple of decades, just consistently. I guess it's for
okay,
a variety of reasons, right? I don't know. Like there's a couple books, couple authors, like researchers that try to figure out why, but I think it's a variety of reasons, largely political, right? Like, why would I trust the government as it is now, who can't even handle a crisis, to run my healthcare, for instance, right?
yeah.
Right? Let's like that, and
Hmm.
I can agree, right? Like I can sympathize with that argument. I can't sympathize with the argument that like because of the fact that we're culturally different, we can't have public education, right? Like
Yeah.
those like collective goods, right? We can't have national parks. We can't have the government work on the roads, right? Like even those Nordic countries don't see themselves as socialists. They see themselves as capitalists with like just a little bit more of that stuff that we've been talking about, right? Roads,
Yeah.
militaries, healthcare, right?
Yeah. So how do we increase, like, as an individual at least, like maybe not at a systemic level, but how do we force our politicians to be more accountable to their actions to increase trust, right? Like,
But like that's the problem, right? Like who's holding them accountable? Like what? Like I like my a thing I thought of like during the semester is like, why don't we have like a fourth branch of government that's just dedicated, like independent of any like voting or whatever, kind of like the Fed, like this, like whoever came up with the Fed, like a genius, right? Like having a branch that's independent of like actual voting, right? So they're
yeah,
independent of like the political part, even though they're kind of like appointed, but like not really, because they're like their own independent body,
yeah,
and like they just run the economy essentially. They run the interest rates, they run like the monetary supply, right? Like all that stuff, right? And having that, like that was genius, right? Because that's a problem. That was a problem in a lot of Latin American countries in the 20th century.
yeah.
Those two aspects were too interconnected, right? Why don't we have like a censorship, not a censorship, because that kind of sounds dystopian, right? But like a um like kind of how we have the what's what like how we have the judicial branch, right? Like as like a semi-independent thing, like having this branch of government that just deals with cases of what's the word, corruption, right?
Okay.
Or like deals with things like gerrymandering, right? Things that are a threat to our into like our government's integrity, if that makes any sense, right? So like, because you can't trust Congress to deal with corruption and deal with like how much Congress is paid, right? Like if
Yeah.
Congress gets it, like things like that, you can't trust Congress to deal with corruption in and of itself, or like how much politicians can be paid by various things, right? Like various outside groups, right?
Yeah.
Campaign finances, I think, would theoretically be like something that independent fourth branch of government deals with. And I think that'd be a great idea. As long as it was not like partisan, right? Because as soon as it becomes partisan, then it's just like Congress. But with
Yeah.
like it's like another branch of Congress.
So, but how do you invent something that's like, how do you invent a body that's apolitical? Like, I
Like
think they did a
even
really
yeah,
good
yeah,
job.
like you're right. Like even the judicial, like even our like Supreme Court, right? Like it's pretty political for at least in
Yeah,
modern times.
yeah, it's like,
Really relative to like where it used to be and also relative to what the founding fathers wanted it to be.
yeah,
Um, but I think like the Fed is an amazing example. Like that's why I was saying that. Like the Fed is like even though like the head is appointed by Trump doesn't mean that they always do when Trump asks. And the fact and that also that credibility aspect, right? The fact that they're usually like PhDs, maybe, right?
yeah,
Like that might have some influence on how impartial they are, even though like the judges are kind of like that. But that's also like the work of a judge is completely different from like it's kind of a different area from like the work of a Fed chair.
yeah.
I don't know.
I
I don't know.
it,
I don't know who would appoint them, right? Like that's another question. I guess like Congress.
yeah. I think that you're pretty much right here, and I feel like the incentives for politicians aren't exactly lined up the way they need to be, and I think that like oftentimes like it's obvious why a politician would act that way, right? Like if there's
Mm-hmm.
no penalty for like politicians essentially receiving bribes for voting one
Mm-hmm.
way or another on legislation that like nobody's going to see because not that many Americans actually care about how they voted on that piece of legislation.
Mm-hmm.
Like things like that, like I can understand why a politician like that doesn't mean it's right, but like it's like setting a cookie in front of a kid and being like don't eat this and then walking away, right? Like it doesn't make sense.
Mm-hmm.
Um
And I also
but
think that.
I
Oh yeah, continue.
for me, I thought like the debate like about this whole like oh Bernie isn't good like Bernie dropped out. Do we still like write him in on ballots and like not vote for Biden? Like that whole debate I found really interesting because at
Mm-hmm.
first I used to be like why would you not vote? Like not voting is a vote for like that whole thing. But
Mm-hmm.
now that I think about it, like if you like not voting is essentially a vote saying I want like a better candidate, right? Like it's sort of like the
Mm-hmm.
free market sorting itself out, but like because it's first past the post, right? All he needs is what like 50% to like get the nomination.
Mm-hmm.
But I do think that Americans need to be more selective in the politicians that they select because I think oftentimes a lot of people just vote based off of party lines. And when like I remember as a kid going to the voting polls with my mom and she would just select the Democratic candidates all the way down.
Mm-hmm.
Like didn't know the candidates, right?
My dad
That
voted for
doesn't really
Larry Hogan. My dad voted for Larry Hogan. Well, that's
um
also because like he knows like the vice lieutenant governor.
okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
But like my parents are like politically involved, but like they're not like doing extensive research past like main offices, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a problem, right? Like then you're just allowing pretty much anybody that puts Democrat like you're pretty much giving them your vote, and I don't think that's like a really good way to actively sort and select good candidates that like actually support most of like yeah if you're a Democrat you vote Democratic like directionally your like ideas and
Mm-hmm.
ideologies are going to be followed right but not like super specifically and especially like on a local level because I think that like federal level politics
Mm-hmm.
doesn't necessarily affect everyone and like we've seen that throughout the entire coronavirus
So
outbreak
what you're
right like
saying is we need more primary participation.
yes pretty much
right? Because like that's where you actually get to choose what flavor of Democrat or what flavor of Republican you want.
Yeah.
I don't know. Also, like when it came to like that fourth branch of government, I also remembered another thing that I thought would be useful, right? Instead of it being elected, it would just be like maybe appointed, right? By let's say like Congress comes up with like this list of people from like each body of Congress, the minority and the majority, and then like, you know, like the top two independent parties, let's say. They come with like their list of like 10 or so um people that they feel like represents their ideologies or whatever, and then kind of put in an algorithm, and then one person from each, or like a couple people from each list, are randomly chosen or whatever. So that's kind of relatively equal to like the distribution of people. Like they're okay. One, they're not subject. Those people on the list would not be subject to like the incentives that kind of occur in elections, but
Mm-hmm.
also it'd be representative of roughly representative of like popular beliefs, right? And kind of balancing that so that maybe you can make a system where like they're not really incentivized by having to fund election campaigns, right? They're not really
Yeah.
incentivized to like be super polarizing in order to get votes, right? They're not
Yeah.
really incentivized like all those things that like kind of muck up Congress, right? They wouldn't kind of fall for that while still being relatively representative of like the ideas of the population as a whole.
Okay. So this is just a hypothetical, right? Like,
Yeah.
what can you give an example of a government that like you are happy with in the world? Like, if America could have this system tomorrow, this is the sort of government I would want. Like,
Well, I mean, I don't know. Okay, so like my main problem with like the current US government is that like people aren't really incentivized to think about whether it be like the media influencing this or like government incentives and like official incentives. Like they're not really incentivized to collaborate,
yeah,
right? Like that's not even like if like, you know, Tulsi Gabbard takes a picture with like John McCain, rest in peace, right? Like
yeah,
if that happened, right? Like and they were like co-sponsoring a bill, right? That wouldn't really get a lot of press, right? Like
yeah.
that's not rewarded, and that should be rewarded, right? I think a system in which that's rewarded, so like maybe some Latin American countries have it, so it's kind of like, and also I think the like a lot of like multi-party countries have it in a way in which like the optimum move for like an executive actor is to put people in their cabinet that don't agree with them so that they gain the support of parties that aren't their own,
So,
right?
so
And I
is
think
this
that
sort of
helps. I think that helps decision making at the top. For instance, like
so is
things
this
like
sort of
that.
partisan? Is the partisanship a symptom of like our voting system, like first past the post, or is it like just the way that we've done it?
Maybe like it's it's a symptom of a couple of things, right? That first past the post is bad, but also I think our government, like this is a relatively new thing. Like yeah, it's had periods of like high partisanship and things like that, but like usually our executives are less partisan just because that's the incentive structure. Like, you know, moderates are more likely to win elections, right?
Yeah.
And in our like I think that's a relatively good thing in the aggregate. It depends on the president how like that's like kind of managed, right? Like I think Barack Obama, when he decided, like, because he was that kind of like Bernie-ish, like
Yeah.
a young change candidate, when he got in office and was like, all right, I don't know anyone in the city, so let's put, you know, Hillary Clinton as my Secretary
Yeah.
of State. Let's put Joe Biden as my VP, because the main concern people had with him was we're inexperienced. It was, you know, he's a little bit too left for my blood, you know,
Yeah.
and kind of calming those while also getting the opinions of like more established figures in the Democratic Party in any given discussion who have been there for like years, right? In any given decision, like I think aided his decision making. I don't think the cabinet composition was perfect by any means, right? I just think that like we can do a lot to incentivize how executives create that.
Yeah. Also, the interesting thing you mentioned is like you're like the focus on the executive branch. Well, I feel like a lot like I think the important slash significant partisanship happens in the legislature, right? Like the executive obviously has a lot of power, but I
Mm-hmm.
think that like long term, like large scale change has
Mm-hmm.
to be policy, right? Like there are
Mm-hmm.
limitations on it. So, but I think you make an interesting argument because I think what people focus on is the executive powers and like what that executive is doing, right? Like like CNN is focused on what Trump said today, what Trump's going to say tomorrow, what Trump said 50 years
Mm-hmm.
ago, right? Like that's all we hear about, and that's the partisanship that's probably more significant because it's like a social partisanship, right? Because like
Mm-hmm.
people's ideologies are moving closer to the ends of the spectrum because of that
Mm-hmm.
like sort of partisanship, and then at the same
And that
time you have
influences like who they vote for and like what they expect the congressman to do. And you can just look at this and like the responses by a lot of Republican congressmen because they're pressured by their constituents who are influenced by Trump, right?
yeah.
Right, and that's like the like I think Teddy Roosevelt came up with this term, the bully pulpit. Like, have you heard that?
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
Right, like the fact that like the president is not just like the singular most powerful person in the world in terms of like just what they're able to do just in general, right? In terms of their abilities, right? The fact that they
Yeah.
have constant access to the media, the fact that
Yeah.
they're always the number one person you see every time you turn on your TV, right? That influences the psyche of America, which influences everything else. So I think that people say the executive doesn't matter are looking at it too like strictly, right? And just look at how Trump has influenced American culture and
Yeah.
even before he got elected, right? Just based on the pulpit, like the pulpit he had before, like during the election and being a mainstream primary candidate, right?
Yeah.
Like
I mean,
just
like,
yeah.
yeah, the responsibility of a politician is like not just to pass legislation, right? Like they're a leader. Their face is going to be on
Mhm.
TV every day, so like they have that dual responsibility. Um, but interesting enough, I think that there's also a lot of people out there that will argue that like one of the main causes of partisanship or like something that fosters partisanship is just the idea like the creation of the filibuster, and they argue that ever since the creation of the filibuster, parties have just abused it to sort of delay legislation until their parties get in power.
Yeah, I guess. Like it's that's more like that. I mean, like I'm not like that. My interests aren't really into like that area, right? Like I don't think that it's like I think it's a symptom more than a disease, right? I don't think
Okay.
that if you got rid of the filibuster or if you got rid of let's say um what was the name of the Supreme Court decision that said, your money is your speech or whatever? So corporate
Oh
what
yeah.
was that?
Okay.
Yeah, that one,
Um.
right? Or if you got rid of something like that, right? I don't think that it would literally restore our democracy. I think that they're more so outlets through which partisan entities, like hyper partisan entities, can exercise their thing and then be cheered on by their side, right? If those entities were not, if that were deemed as like a hyper partisan thing and hyper partisan things were seen as bad, right? If like if like in our culture, in our political culture, we're not fighting over slices of the pie. We're providing input onto the baking of it, right? You know,
Yeah.
right? Like if that became the culture, then like things like that would just be kind of shouted down and like discouraged, which would de-incentivize them in the first place. I think that's the goal, not necessarily to just get rid of that one outlet through which hyperpartisan actors. Right.
Okay.
I
So
think
so
it's
it's
waste. I think it's a waste, not a waste, but like there are more efficient ways to be using political capital than
yeah.
that, right?
So
Like, and that's one of my problems.
so if the solution is to change the way that people think about politics, how do we do that? And like what does it like what does that look like, right? Because I think that there are people that are willing to try to change politics on a very small scale. And I do think that oftentimes there are politicians that get in office and want to change things, right? Like I'm a big fan of AOC, not because like I'm a socialist,
Mm-hmm.
but I just think that like her personality of truly figuring out what her constituents want and then like being on the floor and like being a main proponent of what her constituents want is something that is sort of I think that people automatically go to how do I word this? I think that politicians automatically give up like the truthful ideology that their constituents want, right? Like I don't think that Americans actually care about half the stuff that people talk about in Congress. But I do
Mm-hmm.
think that politicians do know what their constituents want, but just sort of fail to sort of materialize that at a higher level. And because of that, I want politicians that are like one more charismatic and involved in their communities, and then two that are like I don't I guess like very good at not very good at how do I word this? But just essentially understanding how to debate well, right? Because debating is not like I'm right, you're wrong. I think that like the best type of debate is constructive debate, right? It's like my constituents want this. Like it doesn't have to be because like my constituents are poor. They need more money. They
Mm-hmm.
can't afford food.
Yeah.
It
So
doesn't
like
have to be minimum
we'll
wage.
give up like, we'll give up like this certain thing, and then you can get that, and then I can get this, and then we can both eat.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah,
like that
essentially like that.
energy. Yeah.
Like the idea that oh, we don't have to raise the minimum wage. I'm down to try UBI, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
if that's researched and well documented that it does the same exact thing, that works. But I think people are just so holding on like and I think part of this is just because like Congress is old AF, right? Like these guys have been in there like 40, 50 years and like they're not changing
But
their
also,
opinions.
I don't know. Like, do you really think that our generation, or like even like millennials, would be able to like kind of engage in that process of providing their input into the pie, right, and not turning it into like a fight for slices, a fight for space, right? Where it's just like where it's more of a collaborative project versus like a competitive one, right? Like, do you think that like our generation or like the millennials or like are like
I
the
think
younger generations are going to be able to do that at a higher rate than like the boomers?
I think yes, for two reasons. One, I think that technology just like allows you to scale everything, or it does allow you to scale everything to like extents we've never seen before, right? So it's not like I have to go town to town ringing a bell and be like, vote for me. It's like I can like
Mm-hmm.
tweet and like automatically have engagement with thousands of people, right? But two, I also think that like we have a choice to either perpetuate the system or like this system is going to screw us over in the long run, right? Like millennials and like Gen Z are going to be the ones that are like struggling to retire, probably in the middle of like a world that's going through like the problems lying ahead of us in the next 100 years are just ridiculous, right?
Hey guys, this is just the first part of my talk with Jake. If you want more of this, yeah, I mean, I think he's smart, and I think we have some really engaging conversations. If you want more, just make sure to hit a follow, hit a like, whatever platform you're listening to, and I'll get the next part out soon. All right, have a nice day.